Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In a small fog-draped village called Black Hollow, there stood an ancient crumbling mansion known as Ashwood Manor. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, and its once grand facade covered in vines. No one dared to go near it, for the locals believed that the mansion was cursed, haunted by a vengeful spirit that had claimed the lives of many who entered its decaying halls. They whispered of a terrible curse. Anyone who saw the spirit's reflection was doomed to die. The story began long ago, in the early 1800s, when Ashwood Manor was home to a wealthy noblewoman named Lydia Ashwood. Lydia was known for her beauty, but also for her cold, calculating nature. She was obsessed with mirrors, collecting them from all over the world. Her home was filled with ornate glass, each mirror reflecting her image from dawn till dusk. One night during a grand ball at the manor, a terrible fire broke out. The flames spread quickly, consuming the mansion. The guests fled, but Lydia refused to leave her precious mirrors behind. Trapped in her room, surrounded by the reflections of her terrified face, she perished in the flames. When the fire was finally extinguished, her charred remains were found clutching a shattered hand mirror. In the years that followed, strange events plagued those who dared to explore the ruins. People claimed to see a pale woman's face in cracked mirrors, even when standing far away. Others spoke of shadows moving across reflective surfaces with no source. Soon, a pattern emerged. Those who saw the spirit's reflection died under mysterious circumstances, their bodies found with looks of sheer terror frozen on their faces. Despite the warnings, the legend of Lydia Ashwood attracted thrill seekers and skeptics. One such skeptic was a young historian named Daniel Crow. Daniel had spent years debunking ghost stories and urban legends, and when he heard of Ashwood Manor, he was intrigued. To him, it was an opportunity to document another tale of superstition and prove there was no such thing as a cursed spirit. Accompanied by his friends, Maya, an amateur photographer, Liam, an aspiring filmmaker, and Rachel, a local guide familiar with the manor, Daniel planned to explore Ashwood Manor and capture the so-called haunting on camera. "I've heard the stories," Rachel warned as they approached the overgrown estate. "People say it's not just about seeing the ghost. It's seeing her in a reflection. Mirrors, glass, even water. That's how she gets you." Daniel chuckled. "Sounds like a perfect setup for a horror film. Let's get inside before we lose daylight." The group pushed open the heavy wooden doors, which creaked loudly as they swung inward. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of damp wood filled their nostrils. Shafts of light filtered through broken windows, illuminating the decaying interior. Cracked mirrors hung on the walls, their surfaces dulled by time, but enough remained intact to cast eerie reflections. Maya took out her camera, snapping photos of the grand ruined foyer. Liam set up his video recorder, determined to capture any paranormal activity. As they explored, the atmosphere grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. "Do you feel that?" Rachel asked, rubbing her arms. "It's freezing in here." "It's probably just drafts from the broken windows," Daniel said, though he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In one of the upper rooms, they found a massive, ornate mirror that had somehow survived the fire. Its frame was blackened, but the glass was surprisingly clear. Maya stepped forward to photograph it, but as she raised her camera, she froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, lowering the camera. "See what?" Daniel asked, walking up beside her. I thought I saw someone in the mirror," Maya said, her voice trembling. "A woman, standing behind us." Daniel glanced around. "There's no one here, just shadows playing tricks on your eyes." But as he turned back to the mirror, his breath caught. For a brief moment he saw it too, a pale face, framed by wild, burnt hair, staring back at them. Then it was gone. Rachel backed away. "We need to leave. Now." "No," Daniel said firmly. "We came here to find proof, and that's exactly what we're going to do." Over the next few hours, the group explored deeper into the manor. They found more mirrors, each one showing fleeting glimpses of Lydia's ghost. The temperature continued to drop, and a sense of dread settled over them. It was Maya who fell victim first. As she peered into a cracked mirror in one of the bedrooms, she gasped and stumbled back. Her friends rushed to her side, but it was too late. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was unable to speak. Within moments, she collapsed, lifeless. Panic set in. "We have to get out of here," Rachel cried, dragging Liam toward the door. But as they fled, every reflective surface seemed to come alive. Shadows writhed within the mirrors, and Lydia's ghost appeared again and again, her eyes burning with fury. Liam, in his desperation, glanced at a shattered window. He saw her reflection, and in an instant, he too fell dead. Only Daniel and Rachel remained. They ran through the crumbling halls, avoiding mirrors and broken glass as best they could. The ghost's wail echoed through the manor, a sound filled with rage and sorrow. "There's got to be a way to stop this," Daniel shouted. "The story," Rachel said, breathless. "She died holding a mirror. Maybe if we destroy the original mirror, we can break the curse." Frantically, they retraced their steps to the room where they had first seen the large ornate mirror. Lydia's ghost appeared in the glass, her reflection growing more solid with each passing second. Daniel grabbed a heavy piece of wood and swung it at the mirror with all his strength. The mirror shattered into countless shards, each one reflecting Lydia's face. A deafening scream filled the air, and the shadows writhed violently before dissolving into nothingness. The moment the mirror shattered, the oppressive cold lifted. The manor grew silent, and the ghostly presence vanished. Daniel and Rachel stumbled out of the mansion, gasping for breath. They never spoke of what happened inside Ashwood Manor again, but Daniel abandoned his career as a skeptic. Some truths, he realized, were too dangerous to seek. Years later, the mansion was demolished, but rumors persisted that fragments of the cursed mirror still existed, hidden in the ruins, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to glimpse Lydia's reflection. And in the quiet nights of Black Hollow, some still claimed to hear the mournful wail of a spirit forever trapped in the shards of a broken mirror. In the quiet town of Willow's End, there existed a tale that every resident knew but dared not speak of aloud. It was the story of a vengeful ghost named Eleanor Blackwood, a woman whose spirit had cursed the bloodlines of those who had wronged her in life. Though decades had passed since her tragic death, her rage lived on, and her ghost was said to stalk the descendants of her enemies, bringing terror and death wherever she appeared. Blackwood Eleanor. Blackwood had once been the envy of the town. Born into a family of modest means, she had grown into a beautiful, kind-hearted young woman. She fell in love with Henry Whitaker, the son of a wealthy merchant family, and for a time, their love seemed destined to blossom into something everlasting. But Henry's family disapproved of their union. To the Whitakers, Eleanor was beneath them. Her lack of wealth and social standing made her an unsuitable match for their son. In an attempt to break the couple apart, they spread vile rumors about Eleanor, accusing her of witchcraft. In the superstitious climate of the 1800s, such accusations were enough to incite fear and hysteria among the townsfolk. Despite Eleanor's pleas of innocence, the townspeople, driven by fear and fueled by the Whitakers' influence, turned against her. She was dragged from her home and taken to the edge of the forest, where she was condemned to die. As the flames rose around her, Eleanor's last words were a chilling curse. "I shall return, and your bloodlines will pay for your sins." For years after Eleanor's death, nothing unusual happened in Willow's End. The townsfolk carried on with their lives, and the story of Eleanor Blackwood faded into a local legend. But soon, strange occurrences began to plague the descendants of the families involved in her wrongful death. Shadows moved on their own, whispers echoed in empty rooms, and the scent of burning wood would fill the air without cause. The first to fall victim was Margaret Whitaker, Henry's granddaughter. One evening, she was found dead in her parlor, her face frozen in a mask of terror. Though there were no signs of a struggle, witnesses claimed to have seen a shadowy figure lurking near her window shortly before her death. After Margaret's death, others followed, each one a descendant of a family that had played a part in Eleanor's condemnation. The townsfolk grew fearful, believing Eleanor's curse had come to pass. No matter how far the descendants moved or how many generations passed, the ghost's vengeance remained relentless. In the present day, The town's younger generation viewed the story of Eleanor Blackwood as nothing more than an old folktale. Among them was Claire Whitaker, a direct descendant of Henry's line. Unlike her ancestors, Claire was a rational, modern woman who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. She had grown up hearing the story from her grandmother, but dismissed it as superstition. One night, while sorting through old family heirlooms in her attic, Claire found an antique locket. Inside was a faded portrait of Eleanor Blackwood. As she held it, a sudden chill ran down her spine, and she felt as though someone was watching her. Shaking off the feeling, she put the locket aside and continued her task. But that night, Claire's dreams were haunted by visions of a woman in a long black dress. The woman's face was pale, her eyes filled with sorrow and rage. She stood in the shadows watching Claire, whispering words that Claire couldn't understand. When she woke, Claire felt an unshakable sense of dread. She tried to dismiss it as a product of her imagination, but over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Objects in her home moved on their own, mirrors cracked without reason, and the scent of burning wood lingered in the air. Determined to find answers, Claire visited the town's historical society. There she met an elderly historian named Mr. Hargrove, who had spent his life researching Eleanor's story. "The curse is real," Mr. Hargrove said gravely. "You're one of the last remaining descendants of the Whitakers. Eleanor's spirit has been waiting, and now she's come for you." Claire, still skeptical but increasingly frightened, asked, "Is there any way to stop her?" "There might be," Mr. Hargrove said. "According to legend, Eleanor's spirit is bound to the locket she wore the night she died. If you can find her grave and return the locket to her, it might break the curse." That night, armed with the locket and a flashlight, Claire made her way to the edge of the forest where Eleanor had been executed. The old execution site was overgrown and forgotten, but Claire, guided by a strange sense of familiarity, soon found a crumbling headstone bearing Eleanor's name. As she approached the grave, a cold wind howled through the trees, and the ghost of Eleanor Blackwood appeared before her. The spirit's eyes burned with an unearthly light, and her voice echoed like a distant wail. "You cannot undo what has been done. The bloodlines must pay." Claire held up the locket. "I'm sorry for what they did to you," she said, her voice trembling. "I know it won't change the past, but I want to make things right." Eleanor's ghost hesitated, her form flickering like a dying flame. Slowly, she reached out and touched the locket. The moment her fingers brushed the metal, a brilliant light enveloped the grave, and Eleanor's anguished expression softened. "Thank you," the ghost whispered before fading into the night. The air grew still, and the oppressive sense of dread lifted. Claire knew that Eleanor's spirit had finally found peace. Returning to town, she shared her experience with Mr. Hargrove, who confirmed that no more descendants had reported strange occurrences since that night. Years later, Claire would tell the story of Eleanor Blackwood to her own children, not as a warning, but as a lesson in compassion and justice. The curse was broken, but the memory of Eleanor's tragic fate lived on, reminding the people of Willow's End that sometimes the past must be faced to bring peace to the present. And though the ghost of Eleanor Blackwood no longer haunted the bloodlines, on cold, quiet nights, some claimed they could still hear the faint whisper of her voice carried on the wind, watching over the town she had once cursed. In the rolling countryside of northern England stood Blackmore Manor, a sprawling estate that had belonged to the Whitmore family for generations. The manor was filled with priceless heirlooms, antique furniture, ancient relics, and, most notably, a vast collection of paintings. Among these was a particular portrait that hung in the Grand Hall, shrouded in both beauty and mystery. It was known as the Lady in Crimson. The painting depicted a striking woman with raven black hair, piercing green eyes, and a crimson gown that seemed to shimmer with life. Her gaze was intense, as though she were peering directly into the soul of anyone who dared look at her for too long. The origins of the portrait were unknown, and though many whispered rumors surrounded it, no one knew the true story behind the Lady in Crimson. What the townsfolk did know was this: those who insulted the painting met an untimely and gruesome end. The curse first came to light when a guest of the Whitmore family, Lord Henry Becket, visited the manor during a lavish ball. Lord Becket was a pompous man, known for his sharp tongue and disdainful attitude toward anything he deemed beneath him. After several glasses of wine, he wandered into the Grand Hall, where the lady in crimson hung. "Quite an overdone piece, isn't it?" he remarked loudly, drawing the attention of nearby guests. "The artist must have had a love affair with red paint. Hardly worth the space it occupies." Laughter rippled through the hall, but it soon died down when the temperature dropped, and a cold wind seemed to sweep through the room. Lord Beckett, brushing off the strange sensation, returned to the ball, thinking nothing more of the incident. That night, he was found dead in his room. His body was contorted in a grotesque position, his face frozen in a look of sheer terror. No cause of death could be determined, but one thing was certain: whatever had killed him had left him utterly terrified. Word of Lord Beckett's death spread quickly, and soon rumors of the cursed painting began to circulate. Those who had witnessed the incident recalled how he had insulted the portrait shortly before his death. The Whitmore family, already troubled by the strange events, decided to move the painting into a less frequented part of the manor. But the curse didn't stop. Over the years, several others met a similar fate. A servant who mocked the lady's intense stare was found lifeless the next morning. A young artist, visiting to study the manor's art collection, jokingly criticized the crimson dress in the painting and later fell down the grand staircase to his death. Each death was accompanied by the same eerie signs: a sudden drop in temperature, an unexplained draft, and sometimes faint whispers heard by those nearby. Desperate for answers, the current lord of the manor, Arthur Whitmore, sought the help of historians and occultists. One of them, a scholar named Dr. Evelyn Hargrave, took particular interest in the painting's history. After months of research, she uncovered a chilling story. The lady in crimson was believed to be Isabella Blackmore, a noblewoman who had lived over 2 centuries ago. Isabella was known for her beauty, but also for the scandal that surrounded her life. She had been accused of witchcraft by jealous rivals and betrayed by those she trusted most. On the night of her execution, she cursed the townsfolk and vowed that her spirit would live on, seeking vengeance on those who wronged her. Shortly after her death, a mysterious artist painted her likeness, claiming that he had been visited by her ghost. The painting passed through several hands before finally coming into the possession of the Whitmore family. Determined to end the curse, Lord Arthur and Dr. Hargrave devised a plan. They believed that Isabella's spirit was bound to the painting, and that only by appeasing her could they break the curse. Dr. Hargrave suggested holding a ceremony to cleanse the painting, but it required someone brave enough to speak to the spirit directly. Claire Whitmore, Arthur's daughter, volunteered. She was a level-headed woman with a strong will, unafraid of ghost stories. On the night of the ceremony, she stood before the painting, candlelight casting flickering shadows across the grand hall. "Lady Isabella," Claire said softly, her voice steady, "we know of the wrongs done to you. We know of your suffering, but please release your vengeance. Let this curse end." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air grew frigid, and the painting seemed to shimmer. The eyes of the lady in crimson glowed faintly, and a ghostly figure emerged from the shadows, a translucent image of Isabella herself. "You seek to end my curse," the spirit said, her voice echoing through the hall. "But vengeance is all that remains of me. Will you offer your life in place of those who insult my memory?" Claire hesitated but stood her ground. "I offer you peace, not my life. Your suffering can end if you choose to let go." The spirit stared at her, and for what felt like an eternity, the hall was silent. Then slowly the ghost began to fade, and with it, the cold dissipated. The painting's eyes lost their glow, and the oppressive aura that had surrounded it for decades vanished. The curse of the lady in crimson was broken. No more deaths occurred, and Blackmore Manor returned to a semblance of normalcy. The painting remained in the grand hall, but now it was viewed not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of the past. Visitors still came to see the infamous portrait, and though some claimed to feel a chill when they stood before it, no harm ever came to those who treated the lady in crimson with respect. As for Claire, she became known as the woman who ended the curse and brought peace to the restless spirit of Isabella Blackmore. And on quiet nights, when the moonlight streamed through the windows of Blackmore Manor, some claimed they could still hear a soft whisper echoing through the halls, a whisper of gratitude from the lady in crimson. In the small town of Millfield, Nestled between dense forests and rolling hills, there was a crime that no one ever forgot. 20 years earlier, a brutal murder had shaken the quiet town to its core. The victim, a young woman named Margaret Collins, had been found lifeless in her home, her body marked by violence. Despite the town's best efforts, the killer was never caught. Rumors swirled about who could have committed such a heinous act. But one name always lingered in whispered conversations: Harold Crane. A reclusive man in his 40s, Harold had always been something of an outsider. He lived alone in an old creaky house at the edge of town, rarely speaking to anyone. Though the police never had enough evidence to arrest him, many in Millfield believed Harold was guilty, and Harold knew it. He could feel their eyes on him whenever he ventured into town. He could hear the hushed murmurs and see the pointed fingers. But what they didn't know was that Harold had more than their judgment to fear. He was haunted. It started a year after Margaret's murder. At first it was subtle, small things he could explain away, shadows that seemed to flicker in the corners of his vision, whispers he couldn't quite make out, and cold drafts that swept through his home even in the height of summer. Harold, a man of logic despite his isolated nature, tried to convince himself it was nothing. Perhaps it was his guilt manifesting in strange ways. But then it grew worse. Late at night, he would hear footsteps echoing through the empty halls of his house. Doors would creak open on their own, and objects would move from where he had left them. He began to see her, the faint outline of a woman in a white dress, standing at the end of his hallway or by his bedroom door. Her face was blurred, but he knew who she was. "Margaret," he whispered one night, his voice trembling. The ghost didn't respond. She only stared at him, her presence cold and oppressive. As the years passed, the haunting took a toll on Harold's mind. He stopped sleeping, afraid of what he might see in the dark. His once orderly house became a chaotic mess, with furniture overturned and windows boarded up in a futile attempt to keep the ghost out. But no matter what he did, Margaret's spirit remained. Desperate for answers, Harold sought out help. He visited priests, mediums, and occultists, but nothing worked. The spirit was bound to him, they said, tethered by a powerful force, the truth that had never been revealed. "You have to confess," one medium told him. "She's here because of what you did. Admit your guilt, and maybe she'll find peace." But Harold refused. He couldn't admit to the crime, not because he was innocent, but because he feared what would happen if he did. He had gotten away with murder for 20 years. If he confessed now, he would lose everything, including the last shreds of his sanity. Unbeknownst to Harold, Margaret's spirit didn't linger out of vengeance alone. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but to ensure that no one else suffered as she had. She watched Harold for years, hoping he would do the right thing. But when it became clear he never would, she decided to take matters into her own hands. One night, as Harold sat in his dimly lit living room, Margaret appeared before him, clearer than she had ever been. Her eyes, once blurred, now stared into his with a piercing intensity. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Harold cried, his voice hoarse from years of fear and isolation. "You know why," Margaret whispered, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "You took my life. Now you must pay." "I didn't mean to," Harold shouted, tears streaming down his face. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to kill you." For the first time, Margaret's expression softened, but only slightly. "Confess. Let them know the truth." Haunted by Margaret's relentless presence, Harold finally gave in. The next morning, he walked into the Millfield police station, trembling and pale. "I have something to confess," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The officers, stunned by his sudden admission, listened as Harold recounted the events of that fateful night. He had gone to Margaret's house to confront her over a personal dispute. Things had escalated, and in a fit of rage, he had struck her. Panicking, he fled the scene, hoping no one would ever discover the truth. Now, 20 years later, he could no longer live with the weight of his guilt, or the ghost that haunted him. Harold was arrested, and news of his confession spread quickly through the town. Many were shocked, but others felt a strange sense of relief. The mystery that had plagued Millfield for so long was finally solved. That night, as Harold sat alone in his cell, he felt a familiar chill. Margaret appeared once more, But this time there was something different about her. The anger in her eyes was gone, replaced by a calm serenity. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Harold asked, confused. "For finally telling the truth." As she spoke, her form began to fade, becoming lighter and more transparent. "You've given me what I needed. Now I can rest." With those final words, Margaret's spirit vanished, leaving Harold alone in the cold, silent cell. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Harold was sentenced to life in prison, but he didn't fight it. In a strange way, he welcomed the punishment. He had lived with guilt and fear for so long that prison felt almost like a relief. As for Millfield, the town moved on, but the story of Margaret Collins and the haunting of Harold Crane became a local legend. People would often say that justice, no matter how delayed, always finds a way. And on quiet nights when the wind howled through the trees, some claimed they could still hear Margaret's voice whispering in the darkness, a reminder that the truth can never truly be buried. And so the ghost of Margaret Collins found peace, but her story lived on, a chilling tale of guilt, vengeance, and the haunting power of a life unjustly taken. In a quiet seaside town, nestled between cliffs and misty shores, there lived a young woman named Ava Delaney. Ava was known for her kind heart, her love for the ocean, and her radiant smile that could brighten even the darkest of days. One stormy night, she disappeared without a trace. Days later, her lifeless body washed ashore, bruised and battered, with signs of foul play. The townsfolk were horrified, but despite their efforts, no one was ever charged with her murder. Whispers of suspicion fell on Marcus Thorne, a fisherman with a murky past. He had been seen arguing with Ava days before her death, but without evidence, the authorities couldn't act. Marcus thought he had gotten away with it. What he didn't know was that Ava's spirit didn't leave the world quietly. She stayed behind, determined to make sure her murderer would pay. It started with subtle things, small disturbances that Marcus chalked up to fatigue. His fishing nets would be inexplicably tangled, the lanterns in his cottage flickered at odd hours, and cold drafts swept through his home despite the warm summer air. But soon the disturbances became impossible to ignore. At night he would hear whispers, soft, mournful, and filled with sorrow. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew whose voice it was. One evening, as he sat alone in his cottage, Marcus heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. Spinning around, he found no one there. The air grew colder, and then he saw her, a faint, ghostly figure standing near the doorway, her eyes fixed on him. Ava's spirit radiated a cold, pale light, and her expression was one of quiet vengeance. "Leave me alone," Marcus shouted, fear creeping into his voice. But Ava didn't move. Instead, she raised a translucent hand and pointed directly at him. "You can't run forever," her voice whispered, echoing through the room. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus grew increasingly paranoid. He avoided people, stopped going out to sea, and locked himself in his cottage, hoping to escape Ava's relentless presence. But no matter where he went, she was always there, watching him with those sorrowful, accusing eyes. Then one night, everything changed. Marcus awoke to find himself unable to move. His body felt cold, as though he had been submerged in icy water. Standing at the foot of his bed was Ava's ghost, her form more solid than ever before. "It's time," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, commanding tone. Before Marcus could scream, she stepped forward and touched his chest. A searing pain shot through him, and he felt something strange, an otherworldly force pressing into his mind, as though trying to take control. He struggled, but Ava's spirit was relentless. Moments later, Marcus's body went still, his eyes glazing over before blinking again. When he sat up, it wasn't Marcus's mind behind those eyes. It was Ava's. She had taken over his body. With Marcus's body now under her control, Ava began her quest for justice. She used his voice, his hands, and his strength to gather evidence. Evidence that would prove his guilt and bring peace to her restless soul. First, she returned to the cliffs where Marcus had pushed her that fateful night. Digging through the underbrush, she uncovered a locket that had fallen from her neck during the struggle. Inside was a picture of her and her younger brother, a keepsake she never went anywhere without. It was the first piece of evidence. Next, she went to the local pub, where Marcus had bragged drunkenly to a friend about teaching Ava a lesson before her death. Using Marcus's voice, Ava confronted the man, subtly leading him into admitting what he knew. "You were there that night, weren't you?" she said, feigning Marcus's usual arrogance. The man, too drunk to notice anything amiss, muttered an incriminating response. With enough evidence gathered, Ava made her final move. She walked into the police station, still in Marcus's body, and asked to speak to the chief. In a calm, measured voice, she confessed to the crime, detailing everything that had happened the night of her death. The officers, initially stunned by the sudden confession, quickly took Marcus into custody. But as they led him away, something strange happened. Ava felt her grip on his body weakening, as though her purpose had been fulfilled. As they reached the holding cell, Marcus's body collapsed. When he awoke moments later, he was alone, truly alone. Ava's spirit was gone, but the weight of what he had done remained. He tried to plead insanity, claiming he had been possessed, but no one believed him. The evidence was too strong, and his confession too detailed. He was sentenced to life in prison. With her murderer finally brought to justice, Ava's spirit found peace. No longer bound by the need for vengeance, she moved on to the next world, leaving behind only the faintest whisper on the wind, a whisper of gratitude, a final farewell to the world she had once loved. The town of Millfield never forgot the strange case of Marcus Thorne. Some said he had been haunted by guilt until it drove him mad. Others believed the more chilling story, that Ava Delaney had returned from beyond the grave to claim her revenge. And on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the cliffs and the waves crashed against the shore, some claimed they could still hear her voice, carried by the wind, soft, sorrowful, and at peace. In the remote village of Willow's Hollow, nestled deep within a forest untouched by time, an annual festival was held. Known as the Festival of Shadows, it was a tradition passed down through countless generations. Villagers gathered beneath the silver light of the full moon to celebrate the changing of the seasons, lighting lanterns, wearing intricate masks, and performing dances around a massive bonfire. They believed it was a way to honor their ancestors, ensuring good fortune for the year ahead. No one knew exactly how or why the festival had begun, only that it was an unbroken custom. But what the villagers didn't realize was that their joyous celebration masked a far darker purpose. It summoned spirits from beyond the veil of life and death. This year's festival began like any other. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and lanterns swayed gently in the breeze. Children ran through the village square, their laughter echoing beneath the canopy of ancient trees. Stalls lined the streets, offering everything from baked goods to handmade trinkets. At the center of it all was the great bonfire, which would be lit at midnight to signal the height of the celebration. Among the villagers was Lila, a young woman who had recently returned to the village after many years away. She had always found the festival fascinating as a child, but now something about it felt different, darker. There were whispers she hadn't heard before, murmured superstitions about the true meaning of the festival. "They say if you don't wear a mask, the spirits will see you," an old woman told her as Lila browsed a stall of masks. "Best not take any chances, dear." Lila smiled politely and bought a simple mask, though she didn't believe in such things. Spirits were just stories told to frighten children, weren't they? As midnight approached, the villagers gathered around the unlit bonfire. The village elder, a stooped man named Elder Thorne, stepped forward, holding a torch. His voice, though frail, carried authority as he recited the ancient incantation passed down through the ages. "From shadow to light, from past to present, we honor those who came before us. May the veil be lifted, and may fortune bless us for another year." The villagers repeated the chant, their voices blending into a rhythmic hum. Elder Thorne lit the bonfire, and flames roared to life, casting flickering shadows across the crowd. The masked villagers danced around the fire, their movements synchronized with the beating of drums. Lila watched from the edge of the crowd, the hairs on her neck standing on end. There was something about the fire, something unnatural. The shadows it cast didn't move in time with the dancers. Instead, they twisted and writhed as though they had minds of their own. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The temperature dropped sharply, and a thick fog rolled in from the forest, shrouding the village in an eerie gloom. The once lively music grew disjointed, as though the musicians had forgotten how to play. Then came the voices, soft, echoing whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Join us," they said. "We have waited so long." Lila's heart raced as she turned to the person beside her, a man she didn't recognize. His mask obscured his face, but his eyes were wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Before she could answer, a figure emerged from the fog, a translucent form dressed in old-fashioned clothing. More figures followed, their ghostly shapes flickering like candle flames in the wind. The spirits had come. The villagers, unaware of what they had truly done, continued to dance and celebrate, oblivious to the spectral forms moving among them. Only Lila and a few others noticed the growing number of spirits, their masks granting them some protection from being fully seen. "They don't know they're calling them," Lila whispered to herself, horrified. She remembered the old woman's words, "If you don't wear a mask, the spirits will see you." She tightened her grip on the mask she wore, realizing it was the only thing keeping her safe. But others weren't so lucky. A man nearby stumbled, his mask falling off in the process. The moment his face was exposed, the nearest spirit turned sharply toward him, its hollow eyes locking onto his. Before he could react, the spirit lunged, merging with him in an instant. He froze, his body convulsing before standing unnaturally still. When he turned back toward the crowd, his eyes glowed in eerie white, no longer his own. Panic spread as more villagers began to notice what was happening. Spirits swarmed those whose masks had slipped or been removed, possessing their bodies or dragging them into the shadows. Screams filled the air, mingling with the ghostly whispers and the crackle of the bonfire. Lila knew they had to stop the ritual before more spirits could cross over. She pushed her way through the chaos, searching for Elder Thorn. She found him near the bonfire, clutching an ancient tome. His expression was one of terror and regret. "We didn't know," he muttered. "We didn't know the ritual would summon them." "Can you stop it?" Lila demanded. "There's a counter-ritual, but it's dangerous," Elder Thorn said. "If we fail, the spirits will remain forever." Without hesitation, Lila grabbed the torch from him. "Then we'll succeed." Together, they began the counter-ritual, chanting words from the tome as Lila circled the bonfire, tossing herbs into the flames. The spirits shrieked in rage, their forms flickering violently. One by one, they began to dissolve, their connection to the world of the living severed. By dawn, the spirits were gone, and the village was left in stunned silence. Many villagers were missing, either possessed or taken by the spirits. Those who remained huddled around the dying bonfire, their masks clutched tightly in their hands. Elder Thorn declared that the Festival of Shadows would never be held again, the truth of its origins too dangerous to ignore. But even as the villagers tried to move on, Lila knew that something had changed. The veil between worlds had been weakened, and it was only a matter of time before the spirits tried to return. And so, every year on the anniversary of the festival, Lila stood watch at the village's edge, a lone figure guarding against the shadows that might one day rise again. Every October, the small town of Ravensfield prepared for Halloween in a grand fashion. The streets were decorated with orange and black streamers, carved pumpkins adorned doorsteps, and shop windows displayed spooky figures of ghosts, witches, and skeletons. But none of these sights were as anticipated as the annual costume carnival, where townsfolk competed to wear the most creative and terrifying costumes. This year, 17-year-old Emma Hargrove was determined to win. She'd spent weeks brainstorming ideas but couldn't find anything unique enough. Days before the carnival, she decided to visit the town's oldest shop, Wickham's Curiosities, a place known for selling vintage and peculiar items. Wickham's was a dimly lit store crammed with oddities, everything from antique clocks to worn-out books. Emma was browsing through a rack of old costumes when something caught her eye. A striking black and crimson cloak with intricate gold embroidery. It shimmered faintly under the flickering light. And although it looked ancient, it felt oddly new when she touched it. "Ah, you've found the masquerade cloak," said an elderly shopkeeper, his eyes gleaming with a hint of warning. "It's one of a kind, perfect for making a lasting impression." "How much?" Emma asked, ignoring the strange feeling creeping up her spine. The shopkeeper hesitated before naming a price so low that Emma didn't think twice. She paid, took the cloak home, and tried it on in front of her bedroom mirror. As she fastened the golden clasp at her neck, a chill ran through her body. For a moment, Emma felt disoriented. The room seemed darker, her reflection in the mirror appeared slightly distorted, and her eyes, they looked deeper, almost glowing. Shaking off the feeling, she told herself it was just her imagination. The night of the costume carnival was lively as always. The town square was filled with people in elaborate costumes, from classic monsters to mythical creatures. Emma arrived wearing the masquerade cloak, paired with a simple black dress and a gold mask that covered half her face. Everyone turned to look at her as she walked by. The cloak shimmered unnaturally under the streetlights, and whispers followed her through the crowd. Emma smiled, enjoying the attention. For once, she felt powerful, confident, and strangely different. But as the night went on, strange things began to happen. Wherever Emma went, the lights flickered. People near her complained of sudden chills, and animals in the area, usually friendly, started to growl or shy away. "Emma, are you okay?" her best friend Kayla asked nervously. "I'm fine," Emma replied, though her voice sounded colder, almost detached. As midnight approached, the final judging for the costume contest began. Emma was called to the stage, but as she walked up, something strange happened. The cloak tightened around her shoulders, almost as if it had a will of its own. She tried to unfasten the clasp, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as her limbs started to move without her control. "Help!" she tried to shout, but her voice was swallowed by the eerie laughter of the crowd. From the edge of the stage, Kayla and a few others noticed something was wrong. Emma's eyes had turned completely black, and the air around her seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy. Suddenly, the bonfire in the center of the square flared up, casting long, flickering shadows across the crowd. "She's possessed!" someone shouted. The cloak began to transform, its fabric stretching and twisting, enveloping Emma in a swirling vortex of darkness. Her screams echoed through the night, but they sounded distant, as though coming from another realm. Desperate to save her friend, Kayla pushed through the crowd and ran toward the stage. Before she could reach Emma, the old shopkeeper from Wickham's appeared out of the shadows. His face was grim, and he held an ancient-looking book in one hand. "She's wearing a cursed costume," he explained. "It was created centuries ago by a sorcerer who sought eternal life. The cloak possesses its wearer, feeding on their life force until there's nothing left but a hollow shell." "Then how do we stop it?" Kayla demanded. "There's only one way. Remove the clasp and burn the cloak before midnight. If we fail, she'll be trapped forever." Kayla didn't wait for further instructions. As the shopkeeper chanted an incantation from his book, she climbed onto the stage. The air around Emma was freezing, and dark tendrils of shadow reached out, trying to stop her. Summoning all her courage, Kayla grabbed the clasp and yanked with all her strength. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening crack, the clasp broke, and the cloak fell to the ground in a heap. Emma collapsed, gasping for breath as the shadows retreated. The shopkeeper wasted no time. He tossed the cloak into the roaring bonfire, reciting the final words of the incantation. The flames turned a deep purple, and a piercing wail echoed through the night as the curse was destroyed. Emma, now free from the cloak's influence, looked around in confusion. What happened?" "You almost became a prisoner of the cloak," Kayla said, helping her up. "But you're okay now." The next day, Wickham's Curiosities was gone, as though it had never existed. The townsfolk tried to forget what had happened, but whispers of the cursed costume lingered. Some said the sorcerer's spirit had been destroyed with the cloak, while others believed it had merely found a new resting place, waiting for another unsuspecting victim. As for Emma, she never wore a costume again, and every Halloween, she felt a chill when she passed by the spot where the bonfire had burned that night. Though the cloak was gone, she couldn't shake the feeling that something dark still watched her from the shadows, waiting for the next festival. And so in Ravensfield, Halloween was never quite the same again. The town's residents celebrated cautiously, always wary of the stories of the haunted costume. A reminder that some things are best left forgotten.